Hey guys, tonight we're climbing into something a little stranger than usual. The secret history of why so many people spend a small fortune every single year scraping hair off their own bodies with a tiny blade in a slippery shower. We're talking about the Great Hairless Conspiracy, the marketing masterstroke that convinced millions of perfectly normal women that the hair they were born with was a personal emergency. And at the centre of it all sits a razor company that ran out of men to sell razors to and went looking for a brand new problem to invent. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And a sincere thank you to whoever dropped this topic into the comments. These little suggestions of yours genuinely shape the channel, and I'm grateful for every single one. Let me know down below where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world, somehow always at some faintly ungodly hour. Oh, and we're now live on Spotify too, so if you'd rather drift off without a screen glowing in your face, the link is waiting in the description. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft background hum, get comfortable, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's pause for a second. Have you ever wondered who first decided that a woman's leg hair was a scandal? Was it one villain, or an entire committee in a smoky boardroom? Did your great-great-grandmother shave, or did she simply not, and think nothing of it? When exactly did armpits become controversial? And how did a grooming habit that barely existed before your grandmother's time somehow curdle into a thing women now get judged for skipping? Hold on to those questions, because tonight we go hunting for the answers. Congratulations. You've just woken up in 1915 in a tidy American parlour, wearing a brand new sleeveless summer dress, feeling rather pleased with yourself, and someone is about to convince you that your own body is a problem that urgently needs solving. Sleep tight. Let's begin somewhere peaceful, a world where nobody was checking your armpits. Picture yourself as a woman in the 1800s, going about your entire life with every scrap of hair you were born with, completely untroubled, because frankly nobody could see it and nobody had been told to care. Your legs lived under skirts that brushed the floor, your arms hid inside long sleeves in July. The idea that body hair was something to be ashamed of would have struck you as bizarre, possibly the rambling of someone who'd had too much sherry. There was no razor in your wash basin, no shame in your mirror, and certainly no advertisement whispering that you were doing womanhood wrong. Let that sink in for a moment, because it's genuinely hard for a modern brain to hold. You wake up, you dress in roughly 400 layers of fabric, and at no point in your morning does a single thought about smoothness cross your mind. There's no pink disposable razor balanced on the edge of the tub. There's no half-empty can of shaving foam quietly judging you. There's no faint dread about whether you got everything. You are, by today's standards, living in a kind of impossible paradise, and the wildest part is that you don't even know it, because you've never been taught there was anything to escape from. Your daily concerns are elsewhere, and they are plentiful. You're worried about whether the bread will rise, whether the well water will make the children sick, whether your husband's cough is the regular kind, or the kind that empties a household by spring. You're managing a home without electricity, refrigeration, or a single labour-saving device that didn't involve your own two hands. Body hair simply does not make the list. It would be like a medieval peasant lying awake at night fretting about their cholesterol. There are bigger wolves at the door, and most of them are literal. And here's the thing your great-great-grandmother understood instinctively, without ever needing to articulate it. Hair was private because she was private. Her body was hers, tucked away beneath wool and linen, displayed to almost no one and marketed to by absolutely no one. The grooming standards she did follow were about respectability you could actually see. Clean hands, neat hair on her head, a tidy collar. The parts of her hidden under 3 feet of skirt were nobody's business, least of all a stranger's, and certainly not a corporation's. The concept of a faceless company having opinions about her shins would have seemed not just rude, but completely deranged. It's a little like owning a beautifully tiled bathroom that no guest will ever enter. Why renovate? Why scrub the grout to a sparkle? Nobody's looking, nobody's coming over, and nobody, crucially, has been told to expect perfection. You could let that bathroom develop a personality and it would harm no one. That was your body hair in the 1800s, present, unbothered, and entirely off the radar of public opinion. So savour this opening scene, because it's the calm before a very strange storm. Right now, in this quiet, candlelit world, you're free in a way that's almost unimaginable today. Free from a worry that hasn't been invented yet. Spending money on bread instead of blades. Living in blissful ignorance of the multi-billion-dollar industry that will one day be built on your descendants' insecurity. You don't shave. You've never shaved. And the most remarkable thing about your entire life is that this fact has never once occurred to you. Enjoy it. Somebody is about to ruin it. It's time to talk about covering up, because in your great-great-grandmother's day, that's all anyone did. Modesty wasn't a vibe. It was an iron rule book stitched into every hemline. A respectable woman was draped from collarbone to ankle, and the notion of exposing a bare calf in public ranked somewhere between scandalous and arrestable. So your body hair was a private matter in the most literal sense. Private because no living soul outside your household was ever going to lay eyes on it. It's a little like owning a beautifully tiled bathroom that no guest will ever enter. Why renovate? Nobody's looking, and nobody, blessedly, has been told to. Let's get dressed, because getting dressed in this era is a full athletic event. You start with the underthings, then the corset, which you cinch until your internal organs file a formal complaint. Over that goes a chemise, then a petticoat, then possibly a second petticoat for good measure, then the dress itself, which weighs roughly the same as a small dog, and trails along the floor collecting dust, mud, and the occasional unlucky beetle. By the time you're fully assembled, you're wearing more fabric than a modern person owns in total, and the amount of your actual skin visible to the world is approximately your face, and if you're feeling daring, your hands. In this fortress of fabric, the question of leg hair is so irrelevant it's almost funny. Who exactly would ever see it? Your ankles are state secrets. Your knees are classified. A glimpse of bare shin was the sort of thing that ended marriages and started rumours, which meant your legs spent their entire existence in total darkness, like creatures at the bottom of the ocean. They could have grown hair down to the floor and braided it, and society would have remained none the wiser. The arms got the same treatment. Long sleeves were standard, even in summer, even when the heat was thick enough to chew. Sweating through your clothing was considered far more acceptable than bearing an arm, which tells you everything about the priorities of the age. Comfort was negotiable, modesty was not, so your underarms, like your legs, lived in permanent seclusion, untroubled by judgment and undiscovered by advertising. Imagine an entire region of your body that has never once been criticised. To the modern woman, that's not a body part, that's a fantasy. And this wasn't just personal preference, it was enforced by the full weight of social expectation. Showing too much skin didn't just risk a raised eyebrow, it could damage your reputation, your marriage prospects, and your standing in the only community you'd ever know. So the covering wasn't merely fashion, it was armour against gossip, and it had the convenient side effect of making your hairiness completely, gloriously nobody's business. You were modest, and modesty came with an unexpected gift: total privacy from the opinions of the world. Here's the quiet irony, though. All this covering meant the female body became deeply mysterious, hidden, hinted at, imagined more than seen. And mystery, as any marketer will one day learn, is a powerful thing. The less people see of something, the more loaded every eventual glimpse becomes. The Victorians thought they were protecting modesty by burying the body in cloth. What they were actually doing was building enormous pressure behind a dam, so that when fashion finally cracked it open and skin came rushing out, every newly visible inch would feel electric, charged and ripe for someone to have opinions about. But that's a problem for the future. For now, you're sealed away in your fabric fortress, hairy and happy and hidden, judged by no one and sold to by no one. The curtains are drawn. The bathroom remains beautifully, pointlessly unrenovated, and it is for the moment absolutely fine. Here's the part that breaks modern brains. For most of human history, body hair on a woman wasn't considered ugly, dirty, or even noteworthy. It simply was, like elbows or earlobes. There was no booming industry built on convincing you to remove it, no monthly expense, no faint dread before swimsuit season. People had bigger concerns like cholera, childbirth, and not dying of an infected tooth. The Grand Crusade against the female follicle hadn't been launched yet because nobody had figured out there was money to be made in it. Hair was just hair. Imagine the freedom. Now imagine someone deciding that freedom was a marketing gap. Let's sit with how genuinely neutral this was. Body hair, in your great-great-grandmother's world, carried no moral weight whatsoever. It wasn't a sign of laziness. It wasn't a failure of femininity. It wasn't proof you'd let yourself go. It was simply a feature of being a mammal, as worthy of comment as the fact that you had fingernails. Nobody looked at a woman's arm and made a snap judgment about her character. The idea would have been baffling, like judging someone's worth by their kneecaps. And this matters because it proves something the modern world desperately wants you to forget. Disgust is not natural. It's taught. There is nothing inherent in a strand of hair that makes a human recoil. The recoil has to be installed carefully over years by people who benefit from your discomfort. Your ancestors felt no revulsion because nobody had spent decades teaching them to. They looked at body hair the way you look at, say, the hair on your own forearm right now, which, you'll notice, you weren't worried about until I mentioned it. You're welcome. Picture the daily texture of life and you'll understand why hair never made the worry list. You're hauling water. You're tending a fire that could burn the house down if you blink. You're nursing a child while another tugs your skirt and a third is doing something alarming with a knife. You're praying the harvest holds, the rent gets paid, the fever breaks. In a life that demanding, the suggestion that you should also be policing your own follicles would have earned a very tired, very flat stare. It's like worrying about the font on a letter while the building's on fire. The wealthy, sure, had a bit more leisure to fuss over appearance, and some cultures across history dabbled in removal here and there. But even then, it was a personal flourish, not a universal commandment. Nobody was being shamed into it. Nobody felt broken without it. There was no advertisement looming over the wash basin, no comparison to a flawless stranger in a magazine, because the magazine, the mass-produced, image-soaked, anxiety-delivering magazine, hadn't fully arrived yet. The machinery of insecurity simply wasn't built, and that's the quiet tragedy waiting at the edge of this story. Your ancestors weren't more enlightened than you. They were just luckier. They lived in the narrow window before someone realized that a perfectly content woman is a poor customer. A woman at peace with her body buys nothing. A woman taught to despise a part of herself, however, will buy the cure again and again for the rest of her life and hand the habit down to her daughters. One of those women is profitable. Guess which one the future has planned for you. So enjoy this last stretch of neutrality, where hair is just hair, and your body is nobody's problem to solve. It won't last. Somewhere, eventually a man with a clever invention and an empty side of the market is going to look at this contented, unbothered, unshaving woman, and see not a person, but an opportunity, and he is going to get to work. Now, before we crown the 20th century as the sole inventor of hair removal, let's be fair. Plucking, threading, and smearing on strange pastes have existed since the Egyptians and the Romans, who used everything from beeswax to pumice stones to powdered concoctions you would not want near your skin. But, and this is the crucial part, these were personal choices, regional fashions, occasional indulgences of the wealthy, not a moral obligation pressed on every woman alive. Nobody felt defective for skipping it. It was closer to wearing perfume than to brushing your teeth. The leap from some people sometimes do this to every woman must. Forever is the whole story tonight. Let's wander back through the ancient world for a moment, because the methods are genuinely entertaining. In ancient Egypt, the fashionable elite did remove hair using sugar-based pastes, an early ancestor of the sugaring you can still pay good money for today, along with tweezers and pumice. The Romans had their own routines, with the wealthy employing servants to pluck them and various creams promising smoothness, some of which contained ingredients alarming enough to remove the hair, the skin, and possibly the will to live. It was a status thing, a luxury, a signal that you had the leisure and the money to bother. And there it is, the key word, bother. It was something you could bother to do, not something you'd be punished for ignoring. A wealthy Roman woman might smooth her arms the way she might oil her hair, or paint her face, as adornment, as play, as a flex of her comfortable life. The woman down the street hauling fish to market did no such thing, and nobody thought less of her for it. The hairlessness wasn't a baseline of acceptability. It was an optional extra, like a fancy hat. You don't shame someone for not owning a fancy hat. This is the distinction the modern world has completely lost, and it's worth pressing on, because it's the difference between freedom and obligation. A choice is something you reach for when you feel like it. An obligation is something that reaches for you whether you like it or not. Ancient hair removal was a choice. Sporadic, regional, fashionable in some places and unheard of in others, drifting in and out of style across centuries like hemlines and hairstyles always have. What's coming in our story is something altogether different. A manufactured obligation, sold to everyone, framed as non-negotiable, and bolted onto the very definition of being a proper woman. Think of it like cooking. Humans have always cooked. But there's an enormous difference between, I feel like making something nice tonight, and you are a disgusting failure of a person if you do not produce a flawless 5-course meal every single day for the rest of your life. And also, here's the cookware you're legally required to buy. One is a pleasure, the other is a trap with a sales pitch attached. The history of hair removal is the story of how the first thing got quietly transformed into the second. So no, the 20th century didn't invent the act of removing hair. People have been doing that off and on for thousands of years. What the 20th century invented, what makes tonight's story so peculiar and so modern, was the shame. The relentless, manufactured, monetized shame that turned an ancient occasional indulgence into a lifelong compulsory chore, complete with a price tag that renews forever. The Egyptians sugared their arms because they fancied it. Your grandmother shaved hers because she was afraid not to. Same hair, same general goal, completely different world. And the bridge between those two, between the optional flourish and the inescapable obligation, is built almost entirely out of advertising. We're about to watch them lay the first plank. Let's talk about fashion, because fashion is about to betray you. As the new century dawned, skirts started doing something unprecedented. They crept upward. First an ankle, then a daring glimpse of shin. Dresses grew lighter, airier, designed for a generation that wanted to dance and move and ride bicycles, rather than be hauled around like upholstered furniture. It felt like liberation, and in many ways it was. But every inch of newly visible skin was also a fresh patch of territory for someone to scrutinize. The body was stepping out from behind its fabric fortress, and waiting in the wings, sharpening their pencils, were the people who sell solutions to problems you didn't know you had. Picture the change unfolding around you. For your whole life, you've worn skirts that swept the ground, and so did your mother, and so did hers. The floor-length hem was as permanent and unquestioned as the sky. Then, almost overnight, the world starts speeding up. There are bicycles to ride, streetcars to catch, factory floors and office desks where a 30-pound skirt is a genuine hazard. Fabric grows lighter, hems inch upward, not out of rebellion at first, but out of sheer practicality, because it's awfully hard to mount a bicycle when you're wearing what amounts to a fabric circus tent. And it feels wonderful. Your legs can move, you're not sweeping the street with your clothing or tripping on your own hemline every third step. There's air on your ankles for the first time in your life, and it's exhilarating, like cracking a window in a stuffy room you didn't realize was suffocating you. This is progress. This is the modern woman arriving, lighter and freer and faster than any generation before her. You feel like you've escaped something. You have. You've also walked straight into something else. Because here's the cruel arithmetic of exposure. Skin that no one could see was skin that no one could criticize. The floor-length skirt, for all its inconvenience, was a privacy shield, a guarantee that your legs were your own business. The moment the hem rises, that guarantee evaporates. Suddenly your shins exist in public. They have an audience, and anything with an audience can be reviewed. By neighbours, by strangers, and most lucratively, by the advertisers who are about to notice that you're showing brand new skin you've never once been taught to manage. It's a bit like the difference between a private diary and a social media post. The diary can say anything. Nobody's reading it. Nobody's grading it. It's yours. The instant you post the same words publicly, you've handed them to the judgment of the entire world, and somewhere a company is already figuring out how to sell you something to make the next post better. Rising hemlines did to your legs exactly what going public does to a private thought. They turned a personal matter into a performance. Now, fashion didn't do this maliciously. Fashion was just doing what fashion always does. Changing, evolving, chasing the new. It had no idea it was setting a trap. But the trap was being set all the same, because every great marketing campaign needs a stage, and rising hemlines were building one leg length at a time. The advertisers didn't have to invent the exposure. Fashion handed it to them, gift-wrapped. All they had to do was wait for enough skin to appear, then step forward and announce, with grave concern, that this newly visible skin had a terrible problem. So enjoy the breeze on your ankles while it lasts. The freedom is real, and it's genuinely good. But every inch of fabric that rises is an inch of you that just went public, and there are people watching the hemlines climb with the patient, hungry interest of a cat watching a slowly opening door. It's time for the armpit's grand debut, and it does not go well for the armpit. As evening gowns shed their sleeves and modern dancing swept the ballrooms, women suddenly found themselves raising bare arms in public for the very first time in living memory. A whole region of the body that had spent centuries in cosy fabric exile was now out, exposed, and, according to the people about to make a fortune, utterly unacceptable. Think of it like installing a giant window into a room you'd always kept curtained, then having a stranger lean in and gasp. The sleeveless dress didn't just reveal underarms, it revealed an opportunity. Let's set the scene at the dance, because dancing is where it all detonates. The new styles sweeping in around the 1910s demanded movement, arms lifted, twirled, flung overhead in the latest steps that scandalized the older generation and thrilled the younger one. And evening gowns, eager to keep up, did the unthinkable. They dropped the sleeves entirely. For the first time in any respectable woman's memory, you could walk into a ballroom, lift your arms to dance, and reveal the one part of your body that had never, ever seen daylight in mixed company. Imagine the sensation of it. You raise your arm to take your partner's hand, and there's a draft, an actual draft, in a place that has known nothing but the warm darkness of a sleeve since the day you were born. It's strange and a little thrilling and entirely new. You're modern, you're fashionable, you're moving with the music in a dress your grandmother would have fainted at. And tucked into that glamorous moment, completely unbeknownst to you, is the precise vulnerability that an entire industry is about to drive a truck through. Because here's what's also true at that dance. Your underarm, that lifelong fabric hermit, looks exactly as nature intended. Why wouldn't it? It's never been on display. No one has ever had a reason to think about it, including you. There was no expectation to maintain because there was no audience to maintain it for. The sleeve did all the work, and now the sleeve is gone, and your perfectly ordinary, perfectly natural underarm is hoisted into public view, under the bright lights of the ballroom for the very first time, blinking like a creature dragged out of its cave. This is the moment the marketers have been praying for, and you can almost feel them inhale. A brand new patch of visible skin, a patch that has never been groomed because it's never needed to be, a patch that women across the country are now lifting into the air, in public, in their most glamorous and self-conscious moments. If you wanted to design the perfect target for a manufactured insecurity, you could not do better than the freshly bared underarm of 1915. It's exposed, it's unmanaged, and the woman attached to it is already nervous about how she looks at the dance. That's not a body part, that's a sales funnel. Think of it as installing that giant window into the long-curtained room. For years the room was private, messy, lived in, nobody's business. Then you knock out the wall, put in a wall of glass, and the first passerby presses their face to it and gasps in mock horror. The room hasn't changed at all. It's the same room it always was. The only thing that changed is that now it can be seen, and the instant something can be seen, someone will appear to tell you it's not good enough. So the underarm makes its grand entrance, naive and unsuspecting, lifted high in a moment of joy. And somewhere just out of frame, pencil sharpened, the people who profit from your self-doubt watch it rise into the light and think with quiet satisfaction, there it is. The scandal isn't the bare arm. The scandal is what they're about to convince you it means. Let's talk about the new machine quietly changing everything. The printing press on overdrive and the photograph. Magazines were exploding in popularity, glossy and cheap and stuffed with images of impossibly poised women. For the first time, you weren't just comparing yourself to the few dozen people in your village. You were comparing yourself to airbrushed strangers reproduced 1,000,000 times over, and every one of those images could be staged, smoothed, and surrounded by advertisements telling you exactly how to look like them. The mirror used to be your only judge. Now the judge came monthly, by post, and it was always, somehow, disappointed in you. Let's appreciate just how radical this was. For nearly all of human history, the only people you ever compared yourself to were the people you actually met. Your neighbours, your relatives, the women at the market, the faces in your church. A few dozen real humans, all of them as flawed and ordinary as you, all visibly aging and sweating and living through the same hard days. Your sense of normal was built entirely from real people standing in front of you. And real people, as you may have noticed, are reassuringly imperfect. Then the mass-produced image arrives, and it quietly poisons the well. Suddenly there are pictures everywhere, in magazines, on advertisements, on the packaging of products, and the women in those pictures are not your neighbours. They're selected for their beauty, posed by professionals, lit to flatter, and then printed in numbers no village could ever contain. You're no longer measuring yourself against the 30 real women you know. You're measuring yourself against the most photogenic handful of women in the entire country, reproduced 10,000 times over, smiling at you from every surface. It's a rigged contest, and you don't even know you've been entered. Your brain, which evolved to compare you to the people in your immediate surroundings, can't tell the difference between a real person I met and a flawless image printed a million times. To your ancient, comparison-hungry mind, all those magazine women feel like part of your community, like the new normal you're suddenly falling short of. You're competing against an illusion, and the illusion always wins, because it was built to. And the photograph adds a special cruelty the painted portrait never had. A painting was obviously an interpretation, a flattering version everyone understood to be enhanced. But a photograph feels like truth. It feels like a captured slice of reality, which makes the impossibly smooth, impossibly poised women in those images feel achievable. Like this is simply how real women look, and you, with your perfectly normal body, are the strange exception. Of course, those photos were staged and selected, and the women were chosen precisely because they were unusual. But the camera doesn't mention that. The camera just stares back, smooth and serene, and lets you draw the cruel conclusion yourself. It's the same trap that runs at full throttle today, just slower. Scroll through any feed now and you're drowning in filtered, edited, carefully posed strangers, and some quiet part of your brain files them away as what people look like, leaving you faintly inadequate by comparison. The magazine was simply the first version of that feed, monthly instead of endless, paper instead of glass, but doing the identical work of replacing real, flawed humans with an unattainable highlight reel, and then charging you to chase it. And here's the masterstroke. Those flawless images didn't appear alone. They came wrapped in advertisements side by side with the products that promised to close the gap between the impossible woman in the picture and the real one holding the magazine. The image created the wound, the ad sold the bandage. The mirror, at least, only showed you yourself. The magazine showed you everyone you'd never be, and then helpfully told you what to buy about it. Enter our leading man, with possibly the most marketable name in business history, King Camp Gillette. A travelling salesman with a tinkerer's brain, Gillette had cracked a genuinely clever idea: the disposable razor blade. Sell a man a cheap handle once, then sell him blades forever. It was the original subscription model, decades before anyone used that phrase, and it made him spectacularly rich off the chins of American men. By the early 1900s, his razors were everywhere a man had a face. The trouble with selling to every man with a face, of course, is that eventually you run out of faces, and a company that has run out of customers does not simply relax. Let's give the man his due, because the idea really was brilliant. Before Gillette, shaving meant a fearsome straight razor, a long gleaming blade you stropped, sharpened and dragged across your own throat each morning, while praying your hand was steady. It was the sort of tool that demanded skill, nerve, and a deep philosophical acceptance of your own mortality before breakfast. Many men paid a barber to do it, precisely because doing it yourself felt like a coin flip with the grim reaper. Gillette's insight was to take the danger and the skill out of it. A small, cheap, replaceable blade clamped into a safe little holder, dull enough not to kill you but sharp enough to do the job. When it went dull, you didn't sharpen it. You threw it away and snapped in a new one. And there, hidden in that little act of disposal, was the genius that would make him a fortune. He wasn't really selling razors. He was selling an endless, repeating need. Think about the math, because Gillette certainly did. If you sell a man a tool that lasts a lifetime, you make one sale, and then you're done with him forever, a one-night stand of commerce. But if you sell him a cheap handle, and then make him come back week after week for the blades that keep it working, now he's not a customer. He's an annuity. He's a tiny recurring payment marching into your account for the rest of his bristly life. It's the same trick behind the printer that costs nothing and the ink that costs a fortune. Behind every free app that quietly bills you monthly, Gillette just got there first, and he got there with men's faces, and it worked gloriously. By the early 1900s, the safety razor was a runaway success, sitting in wash basins across the country, each one feeding its steady drip of blade sales back to the company. Gillette had done the thing every business dreams of. He'd embedded himself into the daily routine of an entire gender. A man woke up, and there was Gillette, waiting by the sink, asking for a little more money. Multiply that by every shaving man in America, every single morning, and you begin to understand the kind of empire we're talking about. But empires built on faces have a hard ceiling, and it's exactly as tall as the number of faces. This is the quiet anxiety humming underneath all that success. Gillette had nearly won. He'd reached the men who shaved, sold them their handles, hooked them on their blades, and a victory that complete is paradoxically the beginning of a problem. Because once you've sold to everyone, there's no one new left to sell to. The growth slows. The thrilling upward line on the chart starts to flatten into a boring horizontal one, and boards of directors do not survive boring horizontal lines. So picture the company at the height of its triumph, rich and dominant and faintly trapped. It has conquered the entire world of male shaving, and it's standing at the edge of that conquered world, looking around for somewhere, anywhere, left to grow. A company in that position doesn't celebrate, it starts hunting. And it has just begun to glance thoughtfully in a direction it had never once considered. Let's step into the boardroom where the mood is tense. Gillette's company had a beautiful, terrible problem. It had nearly conquered its entire market. Every man who wanted a safety razor had one, or would soon. The blades kept selling, yes, but growth, that sacred word that haunts every business, was flattening out. You can only shave so many male faces before the math stops being exciting. So the executives did what every cornered company eventually does. They looked around the room, then looked out the window at roughly half the population they'd been completely ignoring, and a thought began to form. A profitable, slightly sinister thought. Let's understand why this counts as a crisis, because from the outside it looks absurd. The company is rich, the product is dominant, the blades are selling. By any sane human measure, everyone in that room should be thrilled and on their way to lunch. But businesses do not run on sane human measures. They run on growth, that relentless demand that this year must beat last year forever with no natural stopping point. A company that merely stays successful is, in the cold logic of the boardroom, a company that's failing. And nothing terrifies an executive like a chart that stops climbing. So picture the meeting. The triumph of conquering the male shaving market has curdled into a quiet dread, because conquering a market means you've also exhausted it. There are no new men. Boys grow into shavers, sure, a slow trickle of fresh chins, but you can't build an empire's growth on patiently waiting for toddlers to hit puberty. The room needs more. It always needs more, and there simply aren't any more faces to be had. This is the exact moment that produces history's most consequential bad ideas. The moment when a powerful, ambitious organization runs out of honest growth and goes looking for the dishonest kind. When you can't expand by serving more people who need your product, you have two choices. You can accept that you've reached the natural limit of a thing people genuinely want, or you can invent a brand new need in people who never wanted it. One of these is humble and sensible. The other is enormously profitable. You already know which way the room is leaning, And then someone glances out the window or around the table, and the obvious yet unthinkable occurs to them. There's a whole other half of the population they've never sold a single razor to. Women. An entire gender, completely untouched by the product, sitting right there, holding money, going about their lives in blissful, razorless peace. To the desperate executive eyeing a flattening chart, that's not a group of contented human beings. That's a vast, unclaimed continent, a market the size of all the men they've ever sold to, sitting there pristine and unexploited. There's just one tiny obstacle, and it's a big one. Women don't shave. Not because they haven't gotten around to it, but because there is no need, no expectation, no insecurity, no reason whatsoever. You cannot sell a solution to people who do not have the problem, and women, at this moment in history, simply do not have the problem. Their body hair is private, hidden, unjudged, and entirely fine. The demand the company so desperately wants does not exist. For most businesses, that would be the end of the conversation. No demand, no market, go home. But this is where our story turns from ordinary corporate ambition into something darker and far more clever. Because the people in that room are about to realize a chilling truth, the truth that underpins half the modern economy. You don't actually need real demand. If you're patient, well-funded and unburdened by conscience, you can build it from scratch. You can take a population that feels perfectly fine and, with enough advertising, teach it to feel ashamed. The problem doesn't exist yet, so they'll make one. Here comes the light bulb, and it's worth a fortune. Someone in that company asked the question that would reshape the modern body. What if women bought razors too? On paper, it was absurd. Women didn't shave. There was no demand, no habit, no perceived need whatsoever. But the genius, and it really is a dark sort of genius, was realizing you don't have to find demand. You can manufacture it. You don't sell the razor. First you sell the problem, then you sell the cure. All Gillette needed was to convince millions of women that something they'd never once worried about was suddenly an unbearable flaw. Easy. Let's slow down and admire the sheer audacity of the plan, because it's the kind of idea that's either evil or genius, and is almost always both. Every normal business starts by finding a need and filling it. People are hungry, so you sell food. People are cold, so you sell coats. The need comes first, and the product answers it. What's being proposed in this boardroom flips that entire logic on its head. Here, the product comes first, and the need has to be invented to justify it. They have the razor. Now they just have to make women want it, by making women hate something about themselves. It's the difference between selling water to a thirsty person and convincing a perfectly hydrated person that they're dying of thirst so you can sell them a drink. The first is commerce. The second is something closer to a confidence trick performed at national scale. And make no mistake, that's exactly the project. Women are not thirsty for this. They have to be taught to feel a thirst that was never there, an ache for smoothness they've lived their entire lives without ever once missing. The strategy crystallizes into a beautifully ruthless two-step. Step 1. Sell the problem. Before you can sell a single razor, you have to convince a contented woman that her own body, specifically that newly bared underarm from the dance, is unacceptable, unsightly, embarrassing, a source of shame she should have been worrying about all along. You have to manufacture a wound. Step 2, and only step 2, sell the cure. Once she's looking at her own arm with fresh horror, the razor practically sells itself. She'll pay anything to fix the flaw you so generously installed in her mind. This is the move, and it's worth recognizing because you'll see it everywhere for the rest of your life once you know the shape of it. Mouthwash companies invented halitosis as a dreaded social condition to sell you the rinse. Deodorant ads taught a generation to fear their own sweat. endless products arrive not by answering a need, but by first carving the need into you, then charging you to fill the hole they dug. Gillette didn't invent human insecurity, but they were among the first to industrialize it, to turn manufactured shame into a repeatable, scalable business plan. And the brilliance, the truly diabolical brilliance, is that the cure they're selling renews forever. This isn't like convincing someone to buy a coat once. Hair inconveniently and lucratively grows back. So the moment a woman accepts the manufactured problem and reaches for the razor, she's not making a single purchase. She's signing up for a lifetime of them. Every few days the flaw returns, and so does the need for the blade. It's the men's subscription model all over again, except now applied to a far larger surface of the body and an even larger half of the population. One invented insecurity, monetized weekly, for life. So the decision is made. The company will not wait for women to want razors. It will teach them to. It will reach into the quiet, unbothered confidence of millions of women and install a brand new fear, then sell them the only thing that soothes it. The light bulb has flickered on in the boardroom and it casts a long shadow. Somewhere out there, a woman is getting ready for a dance, lifting her arm, thinking about nothing in particular. She has no idea that a room full of strangers has just decided how she's going to feel about herself for the rest of her life, and that her daughters will inherit the feeling, never knowing it was invented. In 1915, the weapon was unveiled, and it had a name dripping with elegance: the Milady Décolletée. A dainty little razor, marketed not as a tool but as a beauty accessory, packaged like jewellery, and aimed squarely at the woman in her brand new sleeveless gown. It wasn't cheap either, around $5, a serious sum back then, roughly a week's wages for many. But that was part of the magic. It wasn't a hardware purchase. It was an entry fee into modern, fashionable, acceptable womanhood. You weren't buying a blade. You were buying your way out of a shame that, until about 10 minutes ago, you didn't even know you were supposed to feel. Let's hold the thing in our hands, because every detail of it was a small act of persuasion. It was not, heaven forbid, a man's razor with a pink ribbon tied on. It was redesigned, repackaged, and renamed to feel like something that belonged on a vanity table beside the perfume and the powder. The very word décolleté, French for the low neckline of a gown, told you exactly what it was for and exactly who you were supposed to be when you used it. Refined, continental, the kind of woman who wears daring dresses to glittering events. They didn't sell you a tool, they sold you an identity and slipped a blade inside it. And the name Milady, my lady, was doing its own quiet work. It flattered you. It elevated a small metal object into something almost regal, an accessory worthy of a woman of taste. This is salesmanship at its most cunning. Make the customer feel that buying the thing is itself a sign of sophistication, that the purchase doesn't fix a flaw so much as confirm your good breeding. You're not a woman with a hair problem fumbling for a solution. You're Milady, gracefully maintaining the standards that come naturally to your refined sort. Clever, isn't it? They've turned the cure into a compliment. Now let's talk about that price, because the $5 wasn't an accident or an apology, it was strategy. A week's wages for many working people, a genuinely steep sum for what is, mechanically, a small blade in a handle. A cheaper company might have undercut it, but Gillette understood something about human psychology that runs deeper than logic. We suspect that cheap things are for cheap people. By pricing it high, they made it aspirational. The cost wasn't a barrier, it was a signal. Owning the Milady Décolletée meant you could afford to care, that you were on the right side of the line between the polished modern woman and the one who had let herself go. It's the same trick still humming through every luxury counter today. The expensive cream, The premium razor with the vibrating handle and the 11 blades, the moisturizer that costs more by the ounce than gold. None of these work meaningfully better than their cheap cousins, but the price tells you they must, and the price tells everyone else that you're the sort of person who buys them. The Milady Décolleté was the great-grandmother of all of it. The first time a woman was invited to spend real money proving she took the new shame seriously. So there it sits, gleaming in its elegant packaging, a brand new product answering a brand new problem, both of them invented in the same boardroom. You pick it up, you turn it over, and somewhere in your newly anxious mind a small voice, installed only recently by people you'll never meet, whispers that buying it is simply what a proper modern lady does. You hand over your $5, you feel briefly sophisticated, and the trap, baited so beautifully, has just clicked shut behind you with the soft, expensive sound of a vanity drawer closing. Let's read the most consequential beauty ad you've never heard of. Around the same time, the pages of Harper's Bazaar carried a now infamous campaign featuring a graceful model with her arms raised, and copy explaining that summer dress and modern dancing combined to make the removal of objectionable hair a genuine necessity. Objectionable. Sit with that word. Hair that had been entirely unobjectionable for the whole of human history was, in a single sentence, reclassified as a problem of etiquette. It was framed not as a wild new demand, but as something every refined woman simply already understood. And that, my friend, is how you start a war, by pretending it's already been won. Let's look at the image first, because it was engineered with surgical care. A poised, elegant woman, arms lifted in a graceful pose, the picture of fashionable composure, and crucially, her raised arms drawing your eye straight to the underarm. The model is doing nothing scandalous. She's simply existing, beautifully, in the new sleeveless style. But the staging does the talking. It says, here is the modern woman, here is what she looks like, and here is the part of her that you, dear reader, must now think about. You weren't shown a problem. You were shown an aspiration, with a quiet arrow pointing at the spot you were about to start worrying over. Then there's that word, objectionable. Read it again and feel how much work it does. It doesn't argue, it doesn't explain. It doesn't say many women are now choosing to remove underarm hair, and here's why you might consider it. It simply declares, with the calm authority of settled fact, that the hair is objectionable, as though everyone has always agreed on this, as though you'd be embarrassed to admit you hadn't gotten the memo. A single adjective, smuggling in an entire judgment, presented not as one company's opinion but as common knowledge you somehow missed. This is the masterstroke of the whole campaign, and it's worth naming clearly because it's used against you to this very day. The most powerful way to plant a belief is not to argue for it. Arguing invites disagreement. The most powerful way is to assume it, to treat it as already true and move on, so that to question it would make you the odd one out. The ad never says you should feel ashamed of your underarm hair. It says, in effect, as all sophisticated women know, this hair is objectionable, and here is how to deal with it. The shame is baked in as a premise, never stated as a claim, which makes it almost impossible to push back against. It's the difference between someone asking, do you think we should do this? And someone saying so when we do this. The first opens a debate. The second skips it entirely and drags you along because objecting now means objecting to something everyone's apparently already decided. The ad treated the war as already won, and in doing so it largely won it. You don't argue with settled facts. You just quietly comply and hope nobody noticed you were behind. And the timing was lethal. Summer dresses, bare arms, modern dancing. The ad tied the objectionable hair directly to the most exciting, fashionable, aspirational parts of a young woman's life. It didn't say remove your hair. It said this is what modern joy looks like, and this small, embarrassing obstacle is standing between you and it. Who wants to be the one woman at the dance who didn't get the memo? So the campaign rolled out, calm and confident and devastating, and a problem that had never existed was quietly installed in the minds of readers nationwide. No shouting, no hard sell. Just a beautiful woman, a pointed pose, and one carefully chosen adjective that rewrote how millions would feel about their own bodies. The war had begun, and the cruelest part is that most of the women drafted into it never even realised a war was being fought, only that somehow they suddenly had something to be ashamed of. It's time to watch a floor get built from scratch. The advertisers faced a delicate challenge. You can't shame people for something they feel neutral about, so they got to work coining the vocabulary of disgust. Body hair became unsightly, ugly, embarrassing, a humiliation lurking under every raised arm. None of these were facts. They were inventions, repeated so often and so confidently that they began to feel like ancient truths handed down through the ages. It's a magic trick performed in slow motion. Declare something hideous loudly enough, for long enough, in enough magazines, and eventually people forget it was ever declared at all. They just assume it was always true. Let's watch the construction crew at work, because building a floor is a real craft, and these were master builders. The first problem they faced was your indifference. A woman in 1915 looked at her own underarm and felt precisely nothing. No pride, no shame, just the mild non-interest you feel toward your own elbow. And indifference is a marketer's nightmare. You cannot sell a cure to someone who isn't sick, and you cannot make someone sick if they refuse to feel a single symptom. So before they could sell you anything, they had to teach you to feel bad. That was the whole project. Manufacturing a feeling where none had been, and the tool they reached for was language, because language is how we decide what things mean. A patch of hair on its own is just biology, neutral, silent, meaningless. It only becomes unsightly the moment someone attaches that word to it and gets enough people to nod along. So they attach the words deliberately and relentlessly: unsightly, ugly, embarrassing, humiliating. Each one a small label pasted onto a perfectly innocent body part, and each one repeated enough times beginning to stick like a barnacle that no amount of reasoning could scrape off. Here's the part worth shouting from the rooftops. Not one of those words was true. Unsightly is not a property of hair the way warm is a property of fire. There is no scientific instrument that detects unsightliness, no objective quality in the strand itself. It's a verdict, and verdicts have to be issued by someone. Somebody, somewhere, in a room with a budget decided this hair was ugly, and then spent a great deal of money convincing you the decision had been handed down by nature, or God, or your grandmother. It hadn't. It was handed down by an advertising department last Tuesday for money. This is the slow-motion magic trick, and it's genuinely astonishing to watch. In a fast trick, you'd see the deception, the card up the sleeve, the obvious sleight of hand. But spread the trick across years and millions of repetitions, and it becomes invisible. The first ad calling underarm hair objectionable might have struck a reader as a bit much. The 1000th, woven through a decade of magazines, simply felt like a description of reality. By then, nobody remembered it was ever an opinion. The invention had completed its transformation into common sense, which is just opinion that's been repeated until everyone forgot where it came from. You can test how well it worked by how it feels right now. Read unsightly body hair and notice that some part of you doesn't even flinch. It just nods, as if that's simply what body hair is. That nod is the finished product. That reflexive little agreement is the thing they built, brick by brick, word by word, decades before you were born. They didn't just sell a razor. They installed a feeling so deep that it now feels like your own. So the floor gets built from scratch, out of nothing but adjectives and repetition, and then quietly handed to you as if it were ancient. The hair didn't change, your eyes didn't change. The only thing that changed is that someone taught you what to think when you look, and got paid handsomely for the lesson. The unsightly was never on your body. It was always only in the copy. Let's dig into the language itself, because the words did the dirty work. The cleverest campaigns never said, "Buy this so we get rich." They whispered about social ruin. Imagine the horror the ads implied of a man noticing. Picture the whispers at the dance. Consider the mortification of being the one unrefined woman in the room. Hair was tied to cleanliness, to femininity, to whether you were a proper modern lady or some kind of throwback. It's the oldest trick in the salesman's book. Don't sell the product. Sell the fear of life without it. And nothing sells quite like the quiet terror of being judged by people you'll never even meet. Let's eavesdrop on the tone of these ads, because the tone is everything. They almost never barked orders. A barked order, "Buy this razor," invites resistance. Nobody likes being told what to do. Instead, the copy leaned in close and spoke softly, like a concerned friend with terrible news. "Have you considered," it murmured, "what they might be saying about you?" It planted a worry rather than issuing a command, and a planted worry grows on its own, watered by your own imagination, long after you've closed the magazine. And the worry they planted was almost always social. Notice they rarely said the hair would harm you, or make you ill, or feel uncomfortable. The danger was always other people, their glances, their whispers, their silent judgment, the horror of a man noticing, the mortification of being the only woman at the gathering who hadn't kept up. The ad invited you to imagine yourself through the cruelest possible eyes, and then to fix the imagined flaw before those imagined eyes could find it. You weren't being sold a razor. You were being sold relief from a humiliation that lived entirely inside your own head, placed there by the very people offering to remove it. This is fear-based selling in its purest form, and it works because fear is louder than reason. A logical argument: this product is mildly convenient, barely registers, but fear of social ruin hijacks something ancient and powerful, the deep human terror of being cast out by the group. For most of human history, exclusion from your community meant actual danger, even death. The ads quietly tapped that primal wire. They made a patch of hair feel like a threat to your belonging, and belonging is something the human animal will pay almost anything to protect. They also bundle the hair with words that had nothing to do with it, and that bundling was the real sleight of hand. Hair got tied to cleanliness, as though a follicle were somehow dirty, which is biological nonsense. Hair is no more unclean than an eyebrow. It got tied to femininity, as though being smooth were the very essence of being a woman, rather than a sales target dreamed up 5 years prior. By chaining the product to these loaded ideas, the ads made refusing it feel like refusing to be clean, refusing to be feminine, refusing to be a proper woman at all. Suddenly skipping the razor wasn't a neutral choice. It was a confession of failure. It's worth noticing how perfectly this still runs today, just with new products bolted on. Every anxious ad that asks if your breath, your skin, your smell, your home is secretly offending the people around you is reading from the exact same script. Locate a private, harmless feature, attach a social terror to it, then sell the cure for the terror you installed. The vocabulary of shame is a reusable machine. Body hair was simply one of its earliest and most lucrative products, so the words did the work the blade never could. The razor only removed hair. The language removed your peace of mind, replaced it with a low, permanent hum of social dread, and then charged you a recurring fee to quiet it. And the genius, the awful genius, is that the judges you learned to fear were mostly invisible. Strangers, hypotheticals, faces at a dance you might never attend. You were taught to perform smoothness for an audience that wasn't even watching, and to pay, weekly, for the privilege. Welcome to what historians have actually named the Great Underarm Campaign, roughly 1915 through 1919. In just a few short years, a coordinated wave of advertising in women's magazines transformed the underarm from a body part nobody discussed into a battlefield. The repetition was relentless, ad after ad, issue after issue, all reinforcing the same brand new common knowledge, and it worked at a speed that should genuinely frighten you. Within a handful of years, a behaviour that essentially did not exist had become an expectation among fashionable women. No law was passed, no decree was issued, just enough pretty pictures and pointed words to rewrite the rules of an entire body. Let's appreciate the timeline, because it's the most chilling thing in tonight's story. We're not talking about a slow, cultural drift that took centuries to settle in, like table manners or wedding customs. We're talking about a span of roughly 4 or 5 years, less time than it takes to finish school, in which an entire population went from underarm hair is not a thing anyone thinks about to underarm hair is an unacceptable flaw that proper women remove. That's not evolution. That's demolition and reconstruction, done at terrifying speed, and you were standing inside the building the whole time. The fact that scholars later gave it a proper name, the Great Underarm Campaign, tells you it wasn't your imagination or some vague trend. It was a documented, identifiable, coordinated push, traceable through the actual pages of the magazines of the era. Researchers went back and counted, watched the ads multiply year over year, watched the language harden from gentle suggestion into assumed fact. You can chart the manufacturing of an insecurity the way you'd chart a factory's output. This shame had a production schedule, and the weapon was repetition, plain and relentless. Not one brilliant ad, but the same message hammered home month after month, in magazine after magazine, until it stopped feeling like a message and started feeling like the weather. This is how persuasion really works on a mass scale. Not through a single knockout punch, but through sheer grinding frequency. Tell someone something once and they'll question it. Tell them the same thing 1,000 times, from a dozen trusted sources, and they'll eventually defend it as their own deeply held belief. The campaign didn't convince women through logic. It wore them down through ubiquity. Here's the detail that should genuinely keep you up at night. Nobody had to be forced. There was no government mandate declaring underarms must be smooth. No church sermon. No new law. No police enforcing follicle compliance. The entire transformation of how millions of women felt about their own bodies was accomplished through nothing but pictures and words, purchased and placed by companies who profited from the result. It was a revolution in human behaviour carried out entirely by advertising, and it succeeded so completely that most of its targets never even knew a campaign had taken place. That's the part that reframes everything. We tend to imagine that our deepest feelings about ourselves, what we find beautiful, what we find embarrassing, what we'd be mortified to be seen with, come from somewhere deep and personal and authentic. The Great Underarm Campaign is hard, documented proof that some of those feelings can be installed from the outside on a schedule for profit within a few short years and then mistaken for our own forever. If they could rewrite the underarm in 4 years, what else has been rewritten while we weren't looking? So the campaign did its work, swift and quiet and total. The underarm, that lifelong fabric hermit dragged into the light at the dance, was now a battlefield with a settled outcome. Women across the country were reaching for the razor, certain they were simply being clean, modern and feminine, never suspecting they were the final stage of a marketing plan drafted in a boardroom. The war was won in under 5 years, with no shots fired and no resistance organised. because the soldiers on the losing side never even knew they'd been conscripted. Here's a detail that reveals the whole strategy. They came for you in stages. The underarm fell first because the sleeveless dress made it visible, and the campaign was laser-focused. Legs, for the moment, got a pass. Hemline still hovered low enough to keep them mostly hidden, so there was no problem to sell yet. The conquerors are patient. They take the territory the fashion exposes, plant the flag of shame, then wait for skirts to rise and reveal the next frontier. It's less a single ambush and more a slow, decades-long campaign of annexation, 1 inch of skin at a time, each new exposure conveniently arriving with its own matching insecurity. Let's understand why they didn't just go after everything at once, because the restraint is the most revealing part. You might think a company hungry for growth would simply declare all body hair unacceptable from day one and rake in the money. But that would have failed, and the marketers knew it. You can only convince someone to fix a flaw they can actually see. In 1915, legs were still tucked under skirts that fell well below the knee, out of public view, out of mind, and therefore impossible to sell shame about. There was no audience for your shins yet, so there was no insecurity to manufacture. The territory wasn't exposed, so it wasn't worth invading. The underarm, by contrast, had just walked into the open at the sleeveless dance. It was visible, it was novel, and a woman lifting her bare arm was already in a self-conscious, on-display moment. That's where you strike, at the freshly exposed, freshly anxious spot. So they concentrated their entire firepower there, won that battle completely, and then did something that tells you this was strategy and not coincidence. They stopped. They waited. They let the legs be because the legs weren't ready to be sold yet. This is the patience of a conqueror, and it's genuinely a little sinister to watch. A smash-and-grab raider takes everything at once and burns out. An empire annexes slowly, secures one province, settles it, normalizes it, and only then looks to the next border. The hair removal industry behaved like an empire. It took the underarm, made smoothness the feel utterly normal and expected, let a whole generation grow up assuming that was simply how things were, and only when that conquest was complete and unquestioned did it turn its eyes downward toward the next exposed frontier. And the genius of the staged approach is that each new conquest felt natural rather than imposed. If they'd demanded smooth legs in 1915, when legs were hidden, it would have seemed absurd and intrusive, like a company insisting you shave your knees nobody could see. But wait 20-odd years, let hemlines rise on their own, and by the time legs are on display there's already a population fully trained to find body hair unsightly. From the underarm campaign, the shame is pre-installed, you just have to point it at a new body part. The hard work of inventing the disgust is already done, now you're simply extending its territory. It's the same patient logic that runs through so much of modern selling, where the goalposts never stop moving, but always move slowly enough that each shift feels reasonable. First one thing must be perfect, and once you've accepted that, attention quietly turns to the next thing, and the next, each new standard arriving just as the last one becomes routine. You never notice the full distance travelled because you only ever take one small step at a time. Look up after a few decades and the standards have marched from your underarm to your shins, to places the 1910s never dreamed of policing. So remember the sequence, because it's the fingerprint of the whole operation. Underarms first, legs later, and more to come. Each frontier opened by fashion and immediately claimed by shame. They were never in a hurry. They didn't need to be. They had patience, deep pockets, and the certainty that hemlines would keep rising and skin would keep appearing, and that wherever new skin appeared, a freshly tailored insecurity could be waiting there to greet it. Cue the 1920s and the wildest accelerant yet, the flapper. Suddenly young women were bobbing their hair, dropping their waistlines, hiking their hemlines, and dancing the Charleston in dresses that would have caused your grandmother to faint into the punch bowl. Arms were bare as a matter of course now, shimmying, swinging, gloriously exposed. For the hair removal industry, the flapper was a gift wrapped in fringe. A whole generation of rebellious, fashionable, image-conscious young women, all desperate to look modern, all newly displaying the exact body parts the ads had spent years labelling unacceptable. The razor wasn't fighting fashion anymore. Fashion was doing its recruiting for it. Let's drop into the roaring 20s, because the energy of it is intoxicating even a century later. The Great War has ended, the old rules feel suddenly creaky and absurd, and a generation of young women decides, more or less all at once, to set fire to the whole rule book. They cut their hair short, shockingly short, a scandal in itself. They abandon the corset. They smoke in public, dance till dawn, and wear dresses cut for movement, all shimmer and fringe, hems leaping up toward the knee. It's rebellion, it's freedom, it's the most exciting time to be young that anyone can remember, and every thrilling bit of it puts more skin on display. Now here's the beautiful, terrible irony, and it's worth savouring. The flapper thought she was breaking free. She was throwing off the smothering modesty of her mother's generation, claiming her body and her nights and her right to be seen. And in many real ways she was. But that same liberation marched her straight into the waiting arms of the hair removal industry, which could not have designed a more perfect customer if it had built her in a lab. Rebellious, so she'd reject old norms. Fashion-obsessed, so she'd chase the new ones. Constantly exposed, so the flaws were always on view. And young, so the habits she formed now would last a lifetime and pass to her daughters. The bare arm, which a few years earlier had been a daring novelty at a special dance, was now just Tuesday. Flappers raised their arms constantly. Dancing the Charleston practically required it, all that kicking and flailing and waving with the band. An entire generation spent its evenings flinging its underarms into the brightly lit air of every speakeasy and ballroom in the country. If the Great Underarm campaign had built the insecurity, the flapper era gave it a stage, a spotlight, and a live audience every single night. And the flapper was, crucially, image-obsessed in a brand new way. This was a generation raised on the exploding world of magazines, photographs, and soon the movies, drenched in pictures of how a modern, fashionable, desirable woman was supposed to look. They didn't just want to be free. They wanted to be seen as the embodiment of the new ideal. That made them exquisitely sensitive to any suggestion that they fell short of it. Tell a flapper that objectionable hair stood between her and looking like the icon of the age, and she'd reach for the razor without a second's thought. She wasn't being forced. She was racing toward it, certain it was her own idea. So the razor companies got to sit back for once and let the culture do their selling. They'd spent the late 1910s laboriously manufacturing the shame. Now the 1920s handed them a generation primed to feel it acutely, and a fashion that exposed it nightly. The marketing and the moment had locked into perfect alignment. Fashion wasn't the enemy to be overcome anymore. It had become the industry's most effective recruiter, delivering eager young customers by the millions, and asking nothing in return. It's the cruelest little twist in the whole saga. The flapper raised her arm in a gesture of pure liberation, free of the corset, free of the old shame, free of her mother's suffocating world. And in that very gesture of freedom, she displayed the precise spot a boardroom had taught her to fear, reached for the cure they had invented and called it her own modern choice. The smoothest trap is the one you sprint into laughing, certain you've just escaped. Let's talk about the psychology, because these people understood the human mind alarmingly well. the most effective ads didn't lecture. They seduced and then quietly threatened. They paired gorgeous, aspirational images of the woman you long to be with a soft, creeping anxiety about the woman you secretly feared you were. Buy this and belong. Skip it and risk the whispers. It's a recipe still cooking in every beauty aisle today. Create the insecurity, then graciously offer the only cure, conveniently sold separately. You walked into the room a person. You walked out a customer with a brand new flaw and the precise tool to fix it. How thoughtful of them. Let's break the recipe down, because once you can see its ingredients, you'll spot it everywhere for the rest of your life. The first ingredient is aspiration, the gorgeous image of who you could be. Every effective ad dangles a fantasy, the radiant, confident, beloved woman gliding through a glamorous life, smooth and flawless and adored. She's not selling the razor directly. She's selling her, the version of you that exists on the other side of the purchase. You don't want the blade, you want to be her. The blade is just the toll booth on the road to becoming her. The second ingredient is dread, the soft, creeping fear of who you might be without it. This is where the threat comes in, but notice it's always gentle, never shouted. The ad doesn't scream you're ugly. It murmurs about whispers, about a man noticing, about being the one who didn't keep up. It lets your own imagination do the cruelest work, because a fear you generate yourself is far stickier than one handed to you. The ad just cracks the door and your mind helpfully rushes through it to all the worst conclusions. By the time you finish the page, you've frightened yourself more effectively than any copywriter ever could. The genius is in the pairing of those two ingredients, the seduction and the threat held in a single hand. Aspiration alone would make you dream pleasantly and do nothing. Fear alone would just depress you and make you resentful. But braid them together. Here is the wonderful woman you could become, and here is the humiliating fate awaiting you if you don't act, and you've created a powerful current that pulls in only one direction, toward the cash register. Hope pulling from the front, dread pushing from behind, and the product placed neatly in the gap between them, and the whole machine runs on a manufactured gap that the seller created in the first place. This is the part that should make you laugh and wince at once. The advertiser invents the insecurity, declares your underarm objectionable, your legs unsightly, and then, with the warm helpfulness of a friend, presents the one and only solution. They dug the hole, then sold you the ladder. They started the fire, then rented you the extinguisher. The entire transaction is built on a problem that wouldn't exist if they hadn't installed it, and somehow you end up grateful to them for the rescue. You can walk into any drugstore today and watch this exact recipe simmering on every shelf. The serum for the wrinkles you'd never counted, the cream for the pores you'd never noticed, the treatment for the dullness you didn't know your skin had. Each one follows the 1915 blueprint precisely. Show the radiant ideal, whisper the lurking flaw, offer the cure, collect forever. The packaging gets prettier, and the science-sounding words get longer, but underneath it's the same two ingredients the underarm campaign perfected over a century ago. So understand what was really being sold, because it was never about hair. They were selling a feeling, the brief, sweet relief of having addressed a fear they themselves had planted in you. The razor was almost incidental. The real product was the anxiety, and the real business was renting you temporary relief from it, over and over, for the rest of your life. You walked in whole and walked out with a flaw, a fear, and a tool, and the most remarkable trick of all is that they made you thank them on the way out the door. It's worth pausing on the delivery system, because the razor company didn't act alone. The women's magazines were the perfect vehicle, trusted, intimate, arriving monthly into the home like a wise older friend. And tucked between the recipes and the fashion plates sat the advertisements, dressed up to look like helpful advice rather than paid persuasion. The line between here's what's stylish and here's what you must buy blurred until it vanished entirely. Readers absorbed the new rules without ever noticing they were being sold anything. It's a bit like getting life advice from someone who, it turns out, earns a commission on every decision you make. Helpful, technically. Let's understand why the magazine was such a devastatingly effective delivery system, because the where of persuasion matters as much as the what. An ad shouted at you from a billboard is obviously an ad. Your guard goes up, you know someone's selling. But the women's magazine of this era wasn't a billboard. It was a companion. It arrived in your home month after month, year after year, and over time it became a trusted voice, the friend who knew about fashion, cooking, child-rearing, and how to be a proper modern woman. You let it into your most private space and your most private thoughts, and a trusted friend can sell you anything. That trust is exactly what made the magazine so dangerous as a vehicle for manufactured shame. When a stranger on the street tells you your body has a flaw, you can dismiss them as rude or mistaken. But when the warm, familiar voice of your favourite magazine, the one you've read for years, the one that's never steered you wrong on a hemline, gently mentions the same flaw, it lands as friendly counsel. You don't brace against it. You lean in, grateful for the tip. The magazine's credibility, built on genuinely useful recipes and patterns, got quietly loaned out to the advertisers riding alongside. And the real masterstroke was how the line between content and advertising dissolved. The fashion pages told you what was stylish. The advice columns told you how to be your best self. The advertisements told you what to buy, but they all wore the same clothes, used the same trusted tone, sat on the same trusted pages, and so they blurred into one seamless stream of guidance. Was that smooth-armed woman part of an article on summer fashion, or an ad for a razor? Did it matter? The message was identical, the voice was identical, and to the reader settling in for a cosy evening with her magazine, it all simply registered as what modern women do. This blurring is the part worth fixing in your mind, because it's where the persuasion did its quietest, deepest work. When you can tell something is an ad, you evaluate it. Do I want this? Is it true? But when advice and salesmanship are woven together until you can't see the seam, the evaluating stops. You're no longer being sold to. You're just being informed about how the world works by a friend who happens to be on commission. The reader closed the magazine feeling she'd simply learned something about being fashionable, never suspecting she'd been on the receiving end of a coordinated sales operation. It's the great-grandmother of every blurry line that haunts us now. The influencer whose genuine recommendation happens to be a paid partnership. The article that's secretly an advertisement. The trusted reviewer quietly earning a cut. We've put names to these things today, sponsored tags and disclosure rules, precisely because we learned how potent the trick is. But back then there were no such labels. The advice and the selling flowed together, unmarked and unquestioned, straight into the trusting minds of millions of readers. So the razor company never had to do the heavy lifting alone, and that's the lesson of this segment. It had a willing, trusted, intimate partner that visited every home each month and spoke in the warm voice of a friend. The magazine carried the manufactured shame, the last mile, right to the armchair, right into the quiet evening hours, and delivered it dressed as helpful advice. The reader absorbed the new rules of her own body, felt grateful for the guidance, and never once realized that the kindly friend in her lap was, technically, working on commission. Once Gillette proved there was gold in the great hairless panic, the stampede began. Rival razor makers rushed in. Depilatory brands that had quietly existed for years suddenly found a roaring market for their creams and powders, promising smoothness without the blade. Everyone wanted a slice of the freshly invented anxiety. And here's the thing about competition in a manufactured market. It doesn't calm the panic, it amplifies it. Every new company needed you to feel the problem even more keenly, so you'd reach for their particular cure. The shame, once a single seed, was now being watered by an entire industry, each player insisting the danger was real, and theirs was the only true solution. Let's watch the gold rush kick off, because the moment one company proves an insecurity is profitable, the others descend like gulls on a dropped sandwich. Gillette had done the hard, expensive work, manufacturing the shame from scratch, teaching a contented population to feel a brand new fear. That groundwork was enormously costly and slow, but once it was done, once the objectionable hair idea was loose in the culture, anyone could profit from it. Why spend years building an insecurity when your rival has already built one you can simply borrow? So the competitors poured in, eager to harvest a crop they hadn't planted. The depilatory makers were especially well placed to cash in. Creams, powders and pastes that dissolved hair chemically had existed in modest forms for years, sold quietly to a small market that barely knew it wanted them. Brands hawking hair removal powders and pastes had been ticking along in obscurity, and then suddenly the Great Underarm campaign and the flapper craze handed them a nation full of newly anxious women. They didn't have to invent the fear. Gillette had done that. They just had to step forward and say, why scrape with a blade when you can dissolve it away with our pleasant cream instead? Same panic, different cure. And here's the counterintuitive engine that should genuinely fascinate you. More competition made everything worse for the consumer, not better. We're taught that competition is good, that rivals fighting for our business drive down prices and drive up quality. And for an honest product answering a real need, that's often true. But in a market built entirely on manufactured insecurity, competition doesn't soothe the insecurity, it inflames it. Because each company isn't just competing on who has the best razor. They're all competing on the same shared foundation, the belief that your hair is a problem, and every one of them has a powerful interest in making you believe that foundation even more firmly. Think about what that means in practice. The razor company wants you to fear your hair, so you'll buy razors. The cream company wants you to fear your hair, so you'll buy creams. The next brand wants the same. None of them is incentivized to ever question whether the hair is a problem at all. That's the one thing they all agree on, the bedrock beneath their whole war. So while they fight viciously over how you should remove your hair, they form a silent, unspoken cartel on the question of whether you should. And the relentless, multiplied messaging from all of them, all insisting on the same underlying shame, drove that shame deeper into the culture than any single company ever could have managed alone. It's a pattern you can watch operate to this day across whole industries. Rival brands locked in fierce battle, attacking each other's products viciously, yet every one of them quietly united in keeping you convinced of the core insecurity that keeps them all in business. They'll fight to the death over which cure you choose, while standing shoulder to shoulder to make sure you never stop believing you need a cure at all. Competition within a manufactured anxiety isn't a release valve, it's a bellows, and it blows the flames higher. So the seed of shame that Gillette planted in 1915 didn't stay a single modest plant. An entire industry crowded in to water it, fertilize it, and tend it from every angle, each player shouting that the danger was real and only their solution would save you. The poor consumer stood in the middle of this chorus, surrounded on all sides by voices insisting her body was a problem, and concluded, reasonably, given the evidence, that it must be true. After all, why would so many companies, all competing, all agree on the same thing? She never guessed the agreement was the whole trick. Now buckle in, because this is where it turns genuinely dark. In the 1920s and 30s, some entrepreneurs decided that razors were too slow, and offered something permanent: X-ray hair removal. Women sat in salons while machines blasted radiation at their faces and bodies, promising silky, hairless skin forever. And it did remove the hair. It also delivered burns, scarring, disfigurement, and, in horrifying numbers, cancer that surfaced years later. The most notorious of these systems was marketed for over a decade before the damage became undeniable. Let that sink in. The pressure to be smooth had become so intense that women were willingly irradiating themselves over a beauty standard a salesman had invented 20 years earlier. Let's step into the salon, because the scene is almost too grim to be believed. You walk in, a respectable woman of the 1920s, having read one too many ads about your objectionable hair. A pleasant attendant seats you before a machine, reassuringly modern and scientific looking, all dials and humming purpose. There's no pain during the treatment. That's the selling point. The great advance over the tedious scrape of the razor. You simply sit, relax, and let the miracle of science quietly solve your problem forever. You leave feeling like you've stepped into the future. You have in fact stepped into a slow-motion catastrophe. The system at the centre of this horror was marketed as a marvel, a permanent, painless scientific solution run through salons and franchised across the country. And the pitch was devastatingly aimed. It targeted exactly the women the razor ads had already wounded. Those so anxious about their hair, so desperate to be rid of it for good, that the promise of permanence was worth almost any price. They weren't reckless or foolish. They were simply the finished product of a decade of manufactured shame, taking the most logical next step the culture had taught them: make the problem disappear forever. But X-rays do not negotiate, and they do not stop at the hair follicle. The radiation that killed the follicle also damaged everything around it. The harm didn't announce itself in the salon chair. It crept in over months and years. Skin that had been smooth turned thickened, wrinkled, discoloured. Burns surfaced. Then came the scarring, the disfigurement, and, most horrifying of all, the cancers, blooming years later in women who'd done nothing but sit in a chair and try to look the way they'd been told to look. By the time the connection was undeniable, untold numbers had been injured, and some had paid with their lives. What makes this segment the dark heart of tonight's story isn't just the suffering. It's the chain of cause and effect, traced cleanly backward. These women weren't struck by a random plague. They were following a standard that did not exist in their grandmother's time, a standard manufactured in a boardroom and a magazine roughly 15 years prior for the purpose of selling razors. The insecurity was invented for profit, the pressure built, and the pressure grew so crushing that women were willing to irradiate their own bodies to escape it. A marketing campaign, followed to its logical extreme, led directly to the operating table and the grave. It took years, lawsuits, and mounting medical alarm before the X-ray salons were finally condemned and shut down. By then the lesson should have been seared into the culture forever, that a manufactured beauty standard, pushed hard enough, can drive ordinary people to genuinely dangerous extremes. People will risk real harm to escape an imaginary flaw, if only you make the flaw feel real enough. And here's the quiet, chilling echo. We'd love to believe the X-ray horror was a one-time aberration, a strange detour of a less informed age. But the same engine still runs. People still chase risky procedures, swallow questionable pills, and submit to painful treatments in pursuit of standards that someone somewhere manufactured and sold. The technology gets safer looking, and the marketing gets slicker, but the underlying bargain is unchanged. Convince a person their body is wrong, and there is almost no limit to what they'll endure to fix it. The X-ray salon is just the moment the mask slipped, and the true cost of an invented insecurity showed plainly on the skin. Let's return to that patient conquest, because the legs turn has finally arrived. By the 1930s and 40s, hemlines had climbed high enough that legs were now thoroughly on display, and the industry pivoted with the precision of a general who'd been waiting decades for exactly this terrain. The same playbook unrolled all over again. New ads, new problem, new shame, now aimed below the knee. Smooth legs became the fresh frontier of feminine acceptability, and a generation that had grudgingly accepted bare underarms was now told the job was only half done. The goalposts hadn't just moved. They'd been on wheels the entire time, rolling steadily downward toward your ankles. Let's appreciate the timing, because it confirms everything we suspected about the strategy. Recall that back in 1915, the legs got a pass, not out of mercy, but because skirts still hid them, leaving no visible problem to sell. The industry didn't forget about your legs. It simply filed them away and waited, the way a patient predator waits for the terrain to favour it. And by the 1930s and 40s, fashion delivered exactly the terrain they'd been counting on. Hemlines now sat high enough that legs were a regular feature of public life. The province was finally exposed. Time to invade. And invade they did, with a campaign that should feel eerily familiar by now, because it was the underarm playbook run a second time. First, establish that the newly visible body part has a problem. Point the trained eye of shame at the leg the way it had been pointed at the underarm 20 years prior. Then flood the magazines with the right images and the right loaded words. Then offer the cure, conveniently the same razors and creams, now repurposed for a larger surface and a fresh wave of anxiety. They didn't need to reinvent the wheel. They'd built the machine in 1915. Now they simply aimed it lower. But here's what made the leg campaign almost effortless compared to the first one. In 1915, the marketers had faced a population of contented women with no concept of body hair shame whatsoever. They'd had to build the insecurity from raw nothing, a slow and costly labour. By the 30s, that foundation was long since poured and set. An entire generation had grown up already believing body hair was unsightly, already trained to find it embarrassing on the underarm. So when the industry said the legs needed the same treatment, the response wasn't shock or resistance. It was a weary "oh, of course," a recognition that the rule they already lived by simply extended a little farther south. This is the genius and the horror of the staged conquest revealed in full. Each new front is easier than the last because the shame is already installed. You're not manufacturing a new emotion, just pointing the existing one at new real estate. The hard part, the inventing of the disgust, was done once, decades ago. Everything after is expansion. The underarm taught women to find body hair unacceptable. The legs simply collected on that lesson. And a woman accepting that her legs too must be smooth rarely paused to ask why the standard kept growing. She just kept up, as she'd been trained to. And notice the goalposts, because that image is the whole truth of this story. The standard never settled. It never reached a stable, final shape and stopped. The instant the underarm conquest felt complete, the target rolled onward to the legs, and you can be certain that even as the legs fell, eyes were already drifting toward whatever fashion would expose next. The acceptable female body was never a fixed destination. It was a moving target, rolling on hidden wheels, always staying just a few inches ahead of where you'd managed to catch up, which is exactly how it kept you buying. So the legs joined the underarms in the territory of compulsory smoothness, annexed on schedule, exactly as the patient strategists had always intended. A generation barely had time to absorb one demand before the next arrived, each presented as simply the natural extension of the last. And the brilliance, the quiet, relentless brilliance, was that nobody experienced it as an invasion. They experienced it as keeping up, as being a good, clean, modern woman, never noticing that the finish line kept politely, profitably backing away. Here comes an accidental accelerant, courtesy of the Second World War. Nylon, the miracle fabric of women's stockings, was suddenly needed for parachutes and supplies, and stockings vanished from store shelves almost overnight. Women's legs, once politely veiled in sheer fabric, were now bare by necessity. Some painted their legs with makeup and even drew a fake seam up the back with an eyebrow pencil to fake the look of stockings. True commitment. But bare legs needed to be smooth legs to pass muster, and so the wartime shortage quietly handed the razor industry millions of newly exposed, newly anxious customers. War is terrible. War is also, it turns out, an excellent marketing department. Let's set the wartime scene, because the chain of events is almost comic in its accidental cruelty. Nylon had recently arrived as a marvel. Stockings made from it were sheer, durable, affordable, and wildly popular, the must-have leg covering of the modern woman. And then the war came, and nylon was needed for the war effort, woven into parachutes and ropes and 100 military necessities. Practically overnight, nylon stockings vanished from the shelves. The covering that had veiled women's legs in respectable sheerness was simply gone, unavailable at any price, conscripted into the fight. So women faced a sudden, unplanned dilemma. Bare legs, in public, with no fabric to soften or hide them. And remember, by this point the leg campaign of the 30s had already done its work. Legs were supposed to be smooth, presentable, on display. The stockings had been doing double duty, both covering the leg and smoothing its appearance. Pull that fabric away and the leg stands fully exposed with nowhere to hide and a beauty standard still firmly in force. The shortage didn't pause the expectation, it just removed the curtain in front of it. What women did in response is one of the great testaments to how deeply the standard had taken root. Rather than simply going bare and shrugging, many went to extraordinary lengths to fake the missing stockings. They painted their legs with special leg makeup, liquid stockings, the products were called, to mimic the colour and sheen of nylon. And the truly devoted took an eyebrow pencil and carefully drew a thin line up the back of each leg, recreating the seam that real stockings had. Picture the commitment, standing before a mirror, drawing a freehand straight line up the back of your own calf, just so a glance from behind would suggest hosiery you didn't have. That's not vanity. That's the depth of a standard that had become non-negotiable. But here's the part that mattered to the razor industry. A painted leg has to be a smooth leg. You cannot convincingly fake the look of sheer stockings over a leg that nature left as nature intended. The makeup catches, the illusion breaks. So the stocking shortage didn't just expose legs, it made smoothness suddenly essential in a way it hadn't quite been before. When stockings hid everything, a missed patch might go unnoticed. Now, with legs bare or painted, every inch was on show and on the record. The war had, entirely by accident, raised the stakes on smooth legs for millions of women all at once. And so the razor industry received a windfall it never could have engineered on purpose. A global catastrophe had stripped away the fabric that hid and softened women's legs, leaving an entire population of newly exposed, newly self-conscious customers, all of them now needing to maintain smoothness they could no longer disguise. No ad campaign in the world could have produced that result so swiftly or so completely. History had handed the industry a gift wrapped in rationing coupons. War is genuinely terrible, and it was also, for the makers of razors, an unpaid and devastatingly effective sales force. It's a strange, sobering footnote to the whole saga. The compulsory smooth leg, already manufactured by years of advertising, got locked in not by another clever campaign but by a world war and a fabric shortage. The standard was so entrenched by then that women drew fake seams on their bare skin rather than be seen falling short of it. And when the war ended and the stockings came back, the smoothness stayed, because by then, after years of painted legs and pencil seams, a whole generation had simply gotten used to maintaining it. The curtain returned, but the habit it had forced into being was there to stay. Let's roll out the red carpet because the movies sealed your fate. As film and pin-up culture boomed, the silver screen beamed flawless, hairless, impossibly luminous women into every town in the country. Stars in swimsuits, dancers with gleaming limbs, photographs passed hand to hand and pinned to walls. These images set a standard no real human could meet, which was precisely the point. Hollywood didn't just reflect the hairless ideal, it supercharged it, lit it beautifully, and made it aspirational on a national scale. You weren't measuring yourself against the woman next door anymore. You were measuring yourself against a retouched goddess on a 40-foot screen, and the comparison was rigged from the start. Let's take our seats in the darkened theatre, because the cinema added something the magazines never could: scale, motion, and worship. A magazine photo was small, still, held in your hands, but a movie star filled an enormous screen, alive and moving, larger than any human, gazing down from on high while a whole hushed audience adored her. She wasn't just an image of beauty, she was a goddess, presented for veneration, and her gleaming, flawless, hairless limbs weren't a suggestion of the ideal. They were the ideal, projected 40 feet tall in a room full of people staring up in longing. And these women were, of course, the most beautiful and most carefully maintained humans the country could find, then polished further by an entire industry devoted to their perfection. Professional lighting erased every flaw. Makeup artists laboured for hours. Cameras were angled to flatter. Film was selected to glow. And any imperfection that survived all that could be retouched away in the photographs that circulated afterward. What reached the public was not a real woman. It was a manufactured vision of one, the collective effort of dozens of specialists, presented as if it were simply how a beautiful woman naturally looked. The smoothness was total because the artifice was total. The pin-up culture that boomed alongside the movies drove the same image even deeper into daily life. Photographs of glamorous stars and models in swimsuits and leggy poses were printed, passed around, and pinned to walls in homes, barracks, and workshops across the country. Now, the impossible ideal wasn't confined to the theatre or the magazine rack. It was tacked up beside you while you worked, while you slept. A constant companion of gleaming, hairless perfection that you couldn't escape and were quietly measured against every time you glanced up. Here's the rigged comparison at the heart of it, and it's worth naming plainly. For nearly all of history, a woman compared herself to the real women around her, neighbours, relatives, the faces at the market, all visibly human and flawed. That comparison, while never kind, was at least fair. You were measuring yourself against other actual people, living actual lives. Hollywood shattered that fairness completely. Now your reference point for how a woman should look was a professionally constructed illusion, achievable by no living person, including the star herself the moment she stepped off set and out of the lighting. You were entered into a contest you could not win, against an opponent who did not really exist. And losing that rigged contest day after day was exactly the engine the industry needed. A woman who feels she falls short of the gleaming goddess on the screen is a woman reaching for the razor, the cream, the products that promise to close the impossible gap. Hollywood didn't sell hair removal directly. It didn't have to. It simply broadcast an unreachable standard of luminous, hairless perfection to every town in the nation, and let the resulting inadequacy do the selling. The wound was cosmetic, the bleeding was financial. So the silver screen sealed what the boardroom had begun decades earlier. The manufactured insecurity, born in a 1915 magazine, was now beamed in glorious light across the entire country, worshipped in darkened theatres and pinned to a million walls, embodied by goddesses who weren't quite real. The standard had grown from a printed adjective into a national religion of smoothness, complete with idols, and every woman in the congregation, gazing up at the impossible image, learned the same quiet lesson the industry had always meant to teach her, that she, by comparison, would always have a little more work to do. Time to admire the business model, because it's a masterpiece of quiet greed. Remember Gillette's original trick: sell the handle once, sell the blades forever. Now apply it to roughly half the planet, repeating the purchase week after week for an entire lifetime. A man shaves his face. A woman, once the campaign was complete, was expected to shave a far larger surface area, more often, forever. The math is staggering. A single invented insecurity, multiplied across decades and households, became one of the most reliable revenue streams in consumer history. You weren't a customer, you were an annuity. And the beauty of it, from their side of the table, was that you'd been trained to thank them for it. Let's run the cold arithmetic, because once you see the numbers, the whole century-long campaign snaps into focus as the calculated investment it always was. Start with the original genius, the razor and blades model, where the cheap handle is just bait and the real money is the endless river of replacement blades. Apply that to men's faces and you've got a solid business. Now expand your customer base from men who shave to essentially all women too, roughly doubling the addressable population of the entire planet in one stroke. The market didn't grow by a percentage, it grew by a continent. Then multiply by surface area, because this is where it gets almost absurd in the industry's favour. A man shaves his face, a modest patch, requiring a modest amount of blade. A woman, once the standard was complete, was expected to shave underarms and legs, a vastly larger surface demanding more blades, worn down faster, replaced more often. So the new customers weren't just numerous. Each one consumed more product than the original customer ever had. The industry hadn't merely doubled its market, it had doubled it, and then handed each new member a bigger appetite for the one thing that generated all the profit. Then multiply by frequency and by time, and the figure becomes almost dizzying. This wasn't a once-in-a-lifetime purchase like a coat or a kettle. Hair, with magnificent commercial convenience, grows back every few days, faithfully forever. So every customer returned again and again, week after week, year after year, decade after decade, from adolescence to old age. A single woman over a lifetime represents thousands of individual blade purchases. Multiply that by half the population, sustained across generations, and you arrive at one of the most dependable, self-renewing revenue streams ever devised. It's not a sale. It's a subscription that begins at puberty and ends at the grave. This is what the boardroom in segment 9 was really chasing when it eyed that flattening growth chart, and it's worth pausing to recognize the scale of what they pulled off. The cost of manufacturing the insecurity, the years of advertising, the campaigns, the magazine spreads, was, in the grand scheme, a one-time investment. But the return was perpetual. Spend money once to install a lifelong compulsive habit in half the human race, and then collect week after week for as long as that habit endures. There is no better business in the world than one where the customer is trained to need you forever and to feel ashamed when they don't buy. The phrase that fits is the one we keep returning to. You weren't a customer. You were an annuity, a small, reliable, recurring payment marching into the company's accounts for the entire span of your life, and then your daughter's life and hers. The industry didn't want a transaction. It wanted a relationship, the kind that never ends, the kind you can't walk away from, because they've convinced you that walking away makes you unclean. And here's the final, almost unbelievable flourish. They trained you to be grateful for it. The truly masterful con doesn't leave its mark feeling robbed. It leaves them feeling helped. The woman buying her endless blades didn't feel fleeced by a lifelong subscription to an invented problem. She felt clean, modern, well kept, thankful that such a convenient solution to her flaw existed at all. The industry had achieved the rarest thing in all of commerce, a customer who pays you forever for a problem you gave her and says thank you on her way out the door each and every time. Let's settle into the tidy post-war suburb where the habit hardens into holy law. By the 1950s, hairlessness was no longer a fashionable suggestion. It was simply what a clean, respectable, well-kept woman did. Full stop. It joined the great list of unquestioned domestic rituals alongside the perfect lawn and the spotless kitchen. Mothers shaved, daughters watched. The behaviour had been fully laundered of its origins. Nobody remembered it began in a boardroom and a magazine ad. It now felt eternal, natural, beyond question. That's the final stage of any successful manufactured norm. The moment everyone forgets it was manufactured at all and starts defending it as common sense. Let's stroll down the post-war suburban street, because the whole era was practically engineered to lock the habit in for good. After the upheaval of the war, the 1950s swung hard toward order, comfort, and conformity. The ideal was the spotless home, the tidy family, the well-kept wife, everything in its place, every standard met, every surface gleaming. It was an age that prized appearances and rules and doing things properly, and into that climate the smooth, hairless female body fit perfectly. It was just one more standard to uphold in a decade obsessed with upholding standards. And crucially, hairlessness got promoted in this era from fashionable choice to basic requirement of being a decent woman. In the flapper days, it had been the daring mark of the modern girl. Now it was simply expected, like a made bed or a clean kitchen floor. It slid into the great unspoken checklist of post-war womanhood, sitting comfortably beside the manicured lawn and the dinner on the table at 6. Nobody framed it as a fashion statement anymore. It was hygiene, it was upkeep, it was just what you did, as automatic and unremarkable as brushing your teeth. This is the stage every manufactured norm dreams of reaching in visibility. As long as a standard still feels like a choice, like a thing you opt into for fashion or appeal, it remains visible, debatable, refusable. But once it sinks below the level of conscious decision and becomes simply what one does, it disappears from view entirely. Nobody in the 1950s suburb stood at the sink debating whether to shave, weighing the pros and cons, considering the alternative. The question wasn't asked. It had stopped being a question at all and become a reflex, and reflexes are extraordinarily hard to examine, let alone resist. The most striking part is how completely the origins had vanished. By the 50s, the boardroom that birthed the idea, the 1915 magazine ad, the deliberate campaign to invent objectionable hair, all of it had faded from memory. The woman shaving her legs in her tidy suburban bathroom had no notion that her natural sense of cleanliness had been authored deliberately for profit, just a few decades earlier, within her own mother's lifetime. She experienced the standard as timeless, as something women had simply always done, as common sense. The fingerprints had been wiped clean. The invention had become, in every functional sense, a tradition. And here's the quietly powerful mechanism that sealed it. Mothers shaved, and daughters watched. The standard no longer needed magazine ads to propagate, because it had embedded itself into the home, transmitted directly from one generation to the next by simple example. A little girl observing her mother at the bathroom mirror absorbed, without a single word of explanation, that this was part of being a grown woman. No advertising required. The habit had become self-replicating, passed down at the most intimate level, in the most trusted setting, by the person a child believes in most. So in the tidy post-war suburb, the manufactured insecurity completed its transformation into something that felt sacred, an unquestioned law of respectable womanhood, defended as plain common sense by people who had no idea it had ever been invented. It had taken roughly 40 years to travel from a salesman's growth problem to a moral expectation enforced in every suburban bathroom in the land. And the surest sign of the industry's total victory was this: by now nobody was selling the idea anymore. They didn't have to. The culture was selling it to itself, mother to daughter, generation after generation, free of charge. Here's the quietest, most powerful part of the whole machine. It became a rite of passage. Picture being a young girl, watching your mother at the bathroom sink, absorbing without a single word spoken that this is just what women do. No one sat you down and explained the history. No one mentioned the razor company or the campaign. You simply inherited the shame and the ritual together, handed down like a family recipe, generation to generation, each one assuming it had always been this way. That's how an invented insecurity achieves immortality. It stops being advertising and becomes upbringing. The most effective marketing of all is the kind that's done its job so well it doesn't need to advertise anymore. Let's sit in that bathroom doorway as a small child, because this is where the standard does its deepest, most permanent work, not in any magazine, but in the most ordinary moment of family life. You're young, watching your mother go through her routine at the sink, and you see her shave. You don't analyze it. You don't question it. You simply file it away with everything else you're learning about what it means to be a grown woman, alongside how she does her hair and applies her lipstick. It enters you not as an argument to be weighed, but as a fact about the world, as solid and unremarkable as the sky being up. And notice what makes this transmission so much more powerful than any advertisement could ever be. An ad has to overcome your skepticism. Some part of you knows it's trying to sell you something, and your guard stays half raised. But your mother isn't selling you anything. She's the person you trust most in the entire world, the source of nearly everything you know about how to live. When she models a behavior, it carries no whiff of salesmanship. It arrives wrapped in love and authority and the simple assumption of how things are. The standard doesn't have to persuade you. It just has to be present in the home, and you absorb it whole. The most haunting detail is the silence. Nobody sits the girl down to explain that body hair removal is a relatively recent invention, born of a marketing campaign designed to sell razors. Nobody mentions the boardroom or the magazine ad, because nobody in the chain even remembers them anymore. The mother shaves because her mother shaved. The grandmother shaved because the standard was already common sense by her day. The shame and the ritual are passed down together, hand to hand, as a single inherited package, with the receipt long since lost. The girl inherits the what without anyone, anywhere, remembering the why. This is precisely how an invented thing achieves immortality. A campaign, however brilliant, eventually ends. The ads stop running, the budget moves on. But a behavior woven into family life, transmitted by example from mother to daughter, needs no budget and no ad and never stops. It propagates itself for free, forever, each generation faithfully teaching the next without any company lifting a finger. The industry's greatest triumph wasn't any single famous advertisement. It was reaching the point where it no longer needed to advertise at all, because the culture had taken over the job and would do it, unpaid and untiring, indefinitely, it's worth pausing on the strange beauty and horror of that achievement. The ultimate goal of all marketing is to make the customer want the thing on their own, without prompting. And there is no purer version of that than a habit so deeply embedded that it's handed down as a basic part of growing up. The razor companies of a century ago essentially wrote a line of code into the culture's operating system, and it has been copying itself, mother to daughter, ever since, long after the original programmers were dead and forgotten. So the lesson every girl learns is learned in silence, by watching in the most trusted room of the house, with no explanation and no memory of where it came from. She inherits a manufactured shame as if it were a natural fact, and one day she'll stand at the same sink while her own daughter watches from the doorway, passing it along once more. The campaign that began in a boardroom hunting for growth doesn't run as advertising anymore. It runs as childhood, and childhood is the one form of persuasion you never think to question, because by the time you could, it's already become a part of who you are. So here we are, at the soft, quiet end of it all. Tonight we wandered through one of history's strangest little conspiracies. Not a war, not a plague, but a slow and gentle act of persuasion that rewrote how millions of people felt about their own skin. We watched a contented world where hair was simply hair, where your great-great-grandmother lived her whole life untroubled, hidden beneath her skirts and her sleeves. We watched a company run out of faces to sell to and go hunting for a brand new problem. We watched a single word, objectionable, quietly reclassify the human body, and we watched that small seed grow into magazines, movie screens, X-ray salons, painted on stockings, and a habit handed down mother to daughter until no one remembered where it began. And through all of it, there were the women, real, clever, resilient women navigating a standard they never agreed to, doing their best under pressures invented by people they'd never meet. They drew seams up the backs of their legs in wartime. They questioned the rules when questioning was brave. They carried it all with grace, and they deserve a quiet nod of respect tonight. Every one of them. But here's the gentle gift you get to keep. Unlike them, you now know the secret. You've seen the window someone installed and called it nature, and knowing that, you get to do the rarest, freest thing of all, to look at yourself, or anyone, and simply not judge, because you understand how much of judgment was only ever someone's sales pitch. So as you drift off tonight, soft and warm and entirely enough exactly as you are, let that be the last small thought. The things we're told to fix were so often never broken. Sleep well. You owe the marketing nothing. Good night.